Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the BizTalk live session here that we have for January. I'm Valerie Robb, and I have with me Daniel Probert and Andrew Rivers. Today, we're going to discuss the various scripts that are generated by the BizTalk migration tool and what can be done with those scripts, and also helping to troubleshoot when those scripts end up generating errors as we're going to put those artifacts up into Azure. Be sure to post questions in the chat window, and as they come up, and we will get to those questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Cheers, Valerie. Thanks for that. I am just going to share my screen, so hoping everyone can see this. Awesome. Alrighty, hi everyone. Welcome back to another BizTalk Migrator special session. So today, Andrew and I are going to talk a little bit about as Valerie said, the deployment of the artifacts. So you've run the tool and you've generated a whole lot of conversion scripts, and you want to now deploy all that. And we know a few people have had some issues with that. So we're going to talk through why that might happen and what you can do about it. And we're going to introduce a new script that might help some of you with any issues. So just to cover what happened last time on the last BizTalk Migrator special session, we were talking about building and debugging the Migrator locally and talking through how the conversion works so you could make your own changes to the migration tooling. Today, we're going to cover the deployment process. So how does it actually deploy all the resources that are generated? We're going to talk about the limitations of those scripts. So what it can and can't do, and why you might hit issues while you're, if you're running the deployment script. We'll talk through what you can do to troubleshoot them. And we're going to demo a new script that runs through and make sure that you have all the prerequisites necessary before you run the deployment scripts. So it'll try and highlight the major issues, and we'll talk through that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what do you do if you want to use an existing application configuration, or an existing integration account, or even an existing API management. So we're talking a little bit about what's required with that and why it's tricky. Okay, so a little bit of a recap here. We're going to talk through, again, just to remind you how the tool works. So it starts off with an MSI. You've exported your MSI from BizTalk, and inside there are all the BizTalk assemblies that contain the resources needed for your BizTalk application to work. So that's the schemas and orchestrations and pipelines and binding file and everything else. So what happens is the tool extracts out the binding file from the MSI and all the assemblies, the DLLs. So that's the discover phase or discover stage. Then what it starts doing is it reads through the binding file and then looks through all the BizTalk assemblies, pulling out the definitions it finds and builds a source model, and that's the parse stage. Then it starts building a target model. So it works out what things can be migrated. This is the analyze stage. And then after that, it's going to generate a report. It outputs an HTML report showing you what you've got in your MSIs and also what can be converted. And then it's going to generate a whole lot of scripts and templates. And these scripts and templates, this is the convert stage. That's what we're going to be dealing with today. So you've run the tool, you've got a whole series of PowerShell scripts and batch files, and you want to know what you can do with them. All right. So one of the things to understand is there's a lot output by the tool. And we've seen this from some of our clients. They've run the tool and gone, good Lord, there's a lot of scripts and resources being generated. And remember, what is happening here is the tool is attempting to replicate a lot of the functionality that BizTalk gives you. And a lot of BizTalk's functionality is inside the black box. You install BizTalk server and it just works. There's an engine that handles running maps. There's an engine that handles resuming. There's an engine that handles the actual pub sub. But when the tool runs, it's got to recreate a lot of that up in Azure. So there's a lot of bits that get pushed out. Now, in an ideal world, some of this would already exist. and you wouldn't need the tool to put it out there. But what's happening is the tool is generating resources that are used to replicate that BizTalk functionality that your applications will then use. And the idea is that as you add more and more converted applications, they're all using these common resources. So we have a message bus resource group, and in there's an app config store, which is used for storing configuration and the routes or the routes. Then there's an artifact store, which is an integration account for storing your schemas and your maps. Then there's API management, which exposes a number of different APIs, and there's Key Vault and storage. There's a logic app that handles a routing slip, and there's a series of functions. And then there's a system application, which contains mainly logic apps, but also service bus. So there's a service bus topic in there, and that replicates the message bus functionality. And then there's a whole lot of logic apps that replicate the built-in pipeline components you get with BizTalk. So JSON encoder and decoder and flat file decoder and handling XML files. So those are things that would be reused by any BizTalk application. Then you get your specific application as well. So there'll be a receive port and a send port if that's what you've got in your application, although how you would get your messages in without them, I don't know. There's a topic subscriber, which in BizTalk is effectively part of your send port or an orchestration. Any orchestrations are represented as process managers, and then you've got the API connections to support your logic apps. So there's quite a lot here that we're outputting. And what that means is in the conversion folder, once you've run the tool, in the conversion folder, there's a lot of scripts to deploy. All of this needs to be deployed. And the tool tries to help you a little bit by creating a deploy all script. It's a PowerShell file, and we'll look at that in a minute. And what that attempts to do is deploy everything in ascending order. So it starts off at the very basic things and deploys these, then moves on to deploy, things that depend on these, then deploys your system applications, components, and then deploys your application. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about error handling and stuff, but the idea here is that each of those scripts could be taken and put into your own pipeline. So if you're using, DevOps pipelines or GitHub Actions, you can do all that yourself. All right. So the deployment script recap. The tool outputs a series of PowerShell scripts and ARM templates, and they use a combination of the Azure CLI and ARM templates to deploy resources. If you're not familiar with the Azure CLI, it's an alternative to deployment instead of using ARM templates. It used to be that your only real choices for doing deployment to Azure programmatically were either PowerShell commandlets or ARM templates. And if you've ever used Visual Studio for doing development and deployment of Azure resources, you'll be familiar with ARM templates. And ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager. The Azure CLI is relatively new and follows the idea of a command line interface that you can run on any shell. So you can run it in a command line, so if you open up the command prompt, or you can run it in a PowerShell window, a PowerShell shell, or Bash, or whatever your shell might be. You can use the Azure CLI. And the Azure CLI gives you a slightly easier way of deploying resources. With an ARM template, it's a JSON file that can get quite large. With the Azure CLI, it's a command line. So you execute command, and there's a small number of parameters you supply. So a lot of people have chosen to use the Azure CLI over ARM templates because it's easier in terms of what you supply. Having said that, ARM templates are still better when you've got dependencies, so you've got to deploy a number of different resources and they're interlinked in some way. But we use both in the tool. There are two deployment scripts. There's a deploy all PS1 and a teardown PS1. So they're PowerShell scripts. And all they do is they run all the child scripts one after another, and they do them in a particular order. So they will kick off either a full deploy or a teardown. And the scripts that actually are run by here are in subfolders. So underneath deploy all, you'll find folders for the message bus. And in there, you'll find separate folders for either the logic apps or the Azure APIM, so the API management resource, or the Key Vault or whatever. They're all in separate folders. And inside each folder is a set of scripts that are run by this deploy all. Now, deploy all assumes a best case deployment. So it doesn't check to see what you've got. It just runs. So it doesn't really know what you've got in your subscription because everyone's different. For that reason, it can fail if it finds that certain conditions aren't met. And that's what we're going to talk about. And ideally, as I mentioned earlier, what you want to do is you want to add these scripts to your own DevOps pipeline or GitHub Actions. You wouldn't normally be running deploy all.ps1 to do a deployment to Azure. You might do that just for testing, and then you'd go, cool, I'm happy with that. I'm now going to add this to my DevOps pipeline, and you'd add all those scripts to source control and go from there. So there are limitations with these scripts. By default, the script will keep running if an error occurs. And you can change this though. If you go into the deploy all PS1 script, there's an error action in there, and by default, it's set to continue, which means that if one of the child scripts fails, it doesn't stop, it keeps going. But you can change that, and you can change it to stop, I think it is, and it will stop running all the scripts at that point. It won't continue running them. But what it does mean is that if an error occurs, you can get what Valerie calls a wall of red. That because it keeps running, later resources may only partially deploy. So I'll give you an example. Let's say it can't deploy the app configuration. Then APIM fails because it's got a dependency on app configuration, and then a whole lot of logic apps fail because they have a dependency on app configuration as well. So you end up with a lot of red text appearing and scrolling past really, really quickly. And you end up in the situation where you don't really know what's deployed. So has everything deployed or not deployed? And it's difficult to know what you're going to do next. What do you do to fix things in this case? And that's the focus of today's session, to talk a little bit about that. Because I know from our work with the tool and our own clients and Valerie's work with the tool and some of Microsoft clients that people can get a little bit stuck. So let's start off by talking about the assumptions. And I know there's a lot of text here. I'm going to go into a demo very soon and show you some of this. But one of the things that the deployment script assumes is that there's not going to be any conflicts with existing resources. So we're going to be able to deploy everything. And one of the examples there is SKU conflicts, that there are certain resources in Azure where you can only have one of them. So app configuration is an example. If you have, you can only have one instance of app configuration on the free SKU, as in it's free to use. You're allowed one per subscription. So if you try and deploy a second one, it will fail. The same goes with integration accounts. You can only have one free integration account per region per subscription as well. If you try and deploy a second one, it will fail. The next thing that it assumes is that you have the appropriate owner or contributor permissions to deploy. And this is probably more important if you are working for a large organization and you're not an admin. So if you're working in, say, a non-prod subscription and you're not the admin, so you don't have contributor permissions on the subscription, then the scripts will fail for you because they will attempt to create new resource groups and you might not have permission to do that. So that's one thing to check as well. What permissions do you have? Are you going to be able to create all these resources using your own login? And then the last thing is resource providers. And this is something I will go ahead and show you in a minute. And I'm not sure how many people are aware of this. If you're used to doing things in the portal and you go up there and you create your logic apps and everything else, you won't necessarily know about resource providers. But in Azure, with the Azure Resource Manager model, a resource provider is responsible for deployment and undeployment of a particular type of resource. So there's a resource provider for logic apps, there's a resource provider for API management, and one for app configuration or integration accounts or whatever. So there's separate resource providers. And when you first provision a subscription, not every resource provider is registered. Only certain ones are registered, and there's a list of which ones are. And that's not normally an issue if you're using the portal, because if I go into the portal and I say I'm going to create a logic app, the first thing the portal does is check if the resource provider, Microsoft.logic, is registered. And if it's not, it registers it, and then it goes ahead and creates the logic apps. But if you're creating logic apps from script, like from an ARM template, or I don't think logic apps you can do from the Azure CLI yet, and you try and do them, you have to manually register the provider, the resource provider. You have to do it in your script. You have to check if it's registered, and if it's not, then do it. Then try and deploy your resource. And this is probably the number one issue we've heard of with people running the tool, with our own clients running the tool, in that if you've got a new subscription and you've played around with logic apps a little bit, then that resource provider will be registered. But you probably haven't played around with, say, app configuration, and that resource provider won't be registered. So the first thing the scripts do is to try and create an app config instance, and that will fail because the resource provider is not registered. So we'll show you that in a second as well. So there are a number of issues that we've heard about, that we've talked about with Valerie and with our own clients, that it seems most people hit the first time through when they're running the scripts. The first one is hit the Azure CLI is not installed. I mean, this is in the documentation, but it could be that you haven't installed the Azure CLI. Because you might not know you need to. You've installed PowerShell because that comes with Windows, but the Azure CLI is a separate installation that you have to do, perform. The next thing is targeting the wrong subscription. When you run the PowerShell script, the deploy all PowerShell script, it starts issuing Azure CLI commands. And the Azure CLI commands assume that you are logged in and you've already selected a default subscription. The deployment script doesn't do this for you. So you would have to open up a shell, say you open a command prompt up or PowerShell window, and you'd issue the command AZ space login to log into Azure CLI. And that will give you a list of your subscriptions, and in there, one of those will be marked as your default. If you don't change that, and then you run the deploy all PowerShell script, it will start deploying to whatever your default subscription is, and that could be the wrong subscription. So that's one thing to be aware of, and we're going to show you a way. I'm going to show you a script that we've written that will help fix this. And I know of at least one client that has started to do a deployment to the wrong subscription. The next thing is, as I mentioned, the resource provider for Azure App Config might not be registered. This is, I've hit this myself. With a new subscription, you run the tool and you get this error. The next one is that you might have an existing app config implementation or instance using the free SKU. And if you have, the tool attempts to deploy a second one and that fails. And then you end up, because it continues on, you end up with a whole of red text. And then we've got the last one, which is that you might have an existing integration account resource in the same region. If I have a integration account resource in West US, and it's using the free SKU, and I run the tool targeting West US as a region, the deployment scripts will fail because it will say you've already got an integration account there. And the scripts at the moment are not smart enough to go, there's an existing integration account, would you like to use it? They don't do that. They just attempt to deploy a whole new one. And that's why we'll talk about what you need to do to change that. Right, I'm going to show you a demo now of a script that detects those top 5 issues. And I'm going to switch over to my VM here. No, I'm not. I'm going to minimize my VM by accident. Right, so in my VM here, I'm going to show you something. So first of all, I have a brand new subscription here. I've never deployed anything to the subscription. And inside the subscription, if I want to go and see which resource providers are registered already, I can come down here. I've selected, I realize this might be quite small. I can come down inside the subscription here, and I can come down to resource providers. And it will give me a list of the resource providers that are available in my region and tell me if they're registered or not. And you can see that there's quite a few that aren't registered. And if I search for config, it'll show me here's app config is not registered. So if I attempted to provision something, an app configuration instance right now, that will fail. But the same thing applies to logic apps. If I go to logic here, that's also not registered by default. There's only a few that are registered. And these get registered for you, either if you use the portal, and I think if you use an ARM template to deploy a logic app, I think it registers it as well. I haven't tested it. I don't think there's a single subscription I've ever come into where I've attempted to do a deployment of a logic app without first going into the portal and creating a logic app. So I don't know. But this is just something to be aware of. Alrighty. What we're going to do is we are going to run the script that I've got. So on this virtual machine here, I've uninstalled the Azure CLI. So I'm making the assumption that you're in a situation that you're a BizTalk developer, you're attempting to run this tool on your local development machine, and that could be on a laptop or a PC or a virtual machine, and that you don't have the CLI installed because you don't use that with BizTalk. So there is a new script, and we'll talk a little bit about how how the script can be disseminated to people. We're going to speak to Microsoft about putting this in the open source, the GitHub repo. And there's two files. One is a batch file, and the other one is the PowerShell script that runs. And all the batch file does is runs the PowerShell script. And the idea was to make it as easy as possible for people, that you just have to double-click this. So we double-click this to run it. And it's going to run through, and it's going to tell you a whole lot of things. So it's going to tell you the 6 things it's going to check for at the moment. So is the Azure CLI installed? Can you log in to the Azure CLI? Can you select a subscription? Is the Azure App Configuration Resource Provider registered? And if it's not, it will offer to register it for you. Is there a free SKU app configuration already deployed? And are there any free SKU integration account instances deployed? So the first thing the tool does is it starts running through, and is the Azure CLI installed? And we get a failure. The Azure CLI is not installed. And it's going to give you a link to go and download the latest version of the Azure CLI, which I hopefully have already done. And this is a live demo, and I'm actually going to try and install the Azure CLI on this. I hope this doesn't take very long. But here's the latest version of the Azure CLI, which is 2.18. It came out yesterday, I think. So it's going to go ahead and it's going to install that. If you go to the link here, you can download it. It gives you the latest version of the CLI, and you just download and install it. Alrighty, so I'm going to watch that slowly install and hope that does it really, really quickly. One of the things that it's going to do is it's going to do a login for you. It's going to run the AZ login to log into the Azure CLI. And that brings up a browser window where you can type in the login details you want to use. And once it's done that, it's then going to bring up a list of the subscriptions that you have access to. Now, if you do this in a command prompt with the Azure CLI, you always get back JSON by default, because that's what the CLI uses. And you can tell the CLI to give you back a table. But what the script does is it prompts you to select which one of the subscriptions you want to use. If you've only got access to a single subscription, it will select that as your default subscription. One of the things that would be nice to see is it possible to take some of what the script does and build it into the deployment script output by the tool? Because that would actually be quite nice if you could do the deploy all. If you had a batch file and you double click it and it takes you through all these steps, as a CLI installed, select the subscription. Now we're going to do the deployment to that subscription of all the resources. So that's something to talk about with Microsoft to find out if we or someone else wants to do that. This is an open source project. I'm really hoping this isn't going to take too long. I have to keep talking while this goes ahead and installs the CLI. Yes.
Dan, I have a question, because what we've been talking about here has been the free SKU, and some of these really aren't going to be valid issues if you're using a standard or a premium SKU, right? And we could set that when we're running the BizTalk migration tool.
Yes, that is true. So at the moment when the tool runs, and actually this is something that I think maybe Andrew's going to show in his demo, that the model that is output, you can change the SKU that is used. So if you were to say, well, actually, I want to use a standard SKU for app config, it bypasses the problem as well. Because in that case, it would just install a second instance of app config or an integration account or whatever. But yes, you're quite right.
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty. So Azure CLI is now installed. So if I rerun this script here, is the Azure CLI installed? It should now say yes and tell me the version. Yes, 2.18. And now it's going to kick off the login process. So as I mentioned, what happens here is it automatically opens up a browser window. This is what the Azure CLI does. So I can choose what account I want to use. So I'm going to choose my BizTalk Migrator account, and I can now close this window. So now I have to come back to here. So now it says success. You've now logged in, and it tells me who I've logged in as. And then step 3, can I select a default subscription? And what it's going to do, it's going to give me a list of all the subscriptions that my account has access to. Now, I have access to 2 subscriptions with this account. If you only have access to a single account, you'd see a slightly different bit of text here. It would just show you the one, you don't have to select a subscription. It's just going to use the single subscription you have access to. And what you can see here is that I have access to 2 of these. I might have to make this a bit wider to make the table look all right. I have 2 subscriptions, and there are the IDs of those subscriptions. And this one is set as my default. So if I use the Azure CLI and I don't change the subscription, it will be deploying to this subscription. So you have to change the subscription you want to use. And the point of this script is to show you how you do that. So in this case here, this Visual Studio subscription is the one I want to try because that doesn't have app config registered. So I'm going to select the ID and paste it in. You can also select the name, but if the name has spaces in it, you have to use quotes around it. Okay, we'll set that subscription, so it's making that the default subscription. Success. And now it's going to check, is app configuration registered in that subscription? And it's saying that it's not registered. But now what it's going to do is say, would you like to register it? So if you can't do this, if you're not an admin, so registering a resource provider requires specific permissions on a subscription that you might not have. So effectively what's happening here is the script is saying, well, do you want to attempt to register it now? If you've got the permissions, say yes. If you don't have the permissions, you need to follow the steps in this link and ask your Azure administrator to register that provider in your subscription. I'm going to say yes, and it's going to go ahead and attempt to register, and this takes a couple of minutes. I'm realizing maybe I shouldn't have done this because now it'll wait again. Another way around this is you could just go into your portal and create an instance of app config, like using the free SKU, and then delete it. And that will actually register the resource provider for you as it goes through. So it's registering this, and it does take 2 minutes. And then we will be able to continue on. And the next thing it's going to do is check to see, do we have any other resources in that subscription that are using the free SKU. I'm tempted to actually run this again in a separate window, but I think I'll just leave it. So that's running now, and what it's going to do, it is going to, if you remember in here, in fact, this might already have changed if I refresh. Not yet. Okay, so it's registering this. It's going to register this one. And I could, of course, just click on this button to do it as well. But in a second, it will come back and it will have registered it. Oh, there we go. So you can see it's now currently registering it. And we'll go back to this window and it's still going. Oh, it's done. Cool. So that's green. It's finished. Now, is there a free SKU app configuration instance deployed? There's not. Are there any integration accounts deployed using the free SKU? There are not. So excellent news. The deployment script should run with no errors. So it's checked the top 5 issues and sorted them out. So I should now be able to run the deploy all PowerShell script and it will succeed. But what happens if I run this in a subscription where I've already done a deployment? So let's run it again, but this time we're going to select a different subscription. So it's going to ask me to log in again, although I'm already logged in. I can minimize that window, and it's going to give me back that same prompt. This time you'll notice that the Visual Studio one is now marked as default because that's the subscription I used last time. Now I want to use a different subscription. Hold on, let's try that again. So it's setting that subscription, app configuration will be registered. Now look at this. In here, there's a warning because it's saying there is an existing free SKU app configuration, but it's been deployed by the tool. So this is a subscription where I've already done deployment. And what it's saying is that I must remember to use the same unique deployment ID. When you run the tool, one of the parameters you pass in is a unique deployment ID. And that gets put on the end. So the name of the app configuration in this subscription has got BTS at the end. In fact, I can show that if I find here's a list of my app configurations, and you can see the main part of the name is common, but the end is unique, and that's because if Andrew was in his subscription and he deployed app configuration, it would still be called app configuration aim rstore dev, but then he'd have a different suffix at the end. So I've called it BTS. And what I've got to remember is if I run the tool again using a different MSI, if I change the deployment ID, unique deployment ID, what it will attempt to do is create another free SKU in my subscription with a slightly different name, and that will fail. So you've got to use the same unique deployment ID if you're using these free SKUs. Alrighty. Obviously, this isn't a problem if you're not going to use the free SKUs. If you're going to use a standard SKU or a premium SKU, you don't have to worry about this. But this is this new script, and we're going to talk at the end a little bit about how we get this out to the community. And also, I think it would be quite nice to take some of these steps and get them into the tool so that instead of a deploy all PS1, there could be a deploy all presentation. Okay, Andrew.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Great stuff there. So one of the things, the thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit more about the what happens. So Dan's covered off all the things you can fix before you run your deploy all script, and I'm going to cover off a little bit of some of the things that go wrong after you've hit the deploy all script, and see if we can just give you some ideas of a way forward there. So certainly, if we've got an existing app config or integration account, that is going to be a problem. So I will show you how you can use an existing app config or integration account. Now, one of the things is if you remember the slide that Dan showed before about the all the different resource groups that are generated, and the message bus resource group is the one that contains all the Azure resources that are related generically to messaging. And that includes API management, it includes the service bus namespace, it includes the integration account, and it includes the app config. Now they all go in message bus. So at the moment, the tool is just assuming that all of those are in this. Certainly from a deployment perspective, the tool is, if we could have all our wishes granted, would be that each of the resources that we needed we could actually specify the name of it and the resource group, so we could just on a resource by resource basis we could select the resource group that they're going towards. But at the moment, certainly the way that the scripts are being generated by the migrator, the assumption is that all those resources are in the same resource group. And so do you want to just move on one, Dan? So there we go. So if you want to use an existing app config and integration account, there are a couple of limitations at the moment. One of them is that you need to have them in the same resource group, and the other one is that that as we go through the deployment, that we'll need to put that will effectively what we'll need to do is need to repoint the deployment for the message bus into that resource group where your existing app config and integration accounts are, and then everything will deploy into that, and then we will be able to just continue with the rest of the deployment. Because when we deploy artifacts later on that reference things like app config, we need to specify the resource group and the resource name. And so we've only really got, the way the scripts are built, they're built with one key, that one name for the resource group for the message bus. Okay, so let's move on. I think is that the last one on that? I think is that the last bullet point on that? There we go. We've been looking at what it would take to have the scripts for that, and that is what I'm going to demonstrate now. So if we move on to the next demo, I will just share my development workstation. Has that come through now? So okay, so there's the presentation. So what I'm going to go through now, I'm going to go through a few things. So we're going to talk about the things that are in the message bus. So and then we're going to look at the an existing resource group that I've created with app config and integration account in it. Then we'll have a look at what the wall of red looks like. So if it hasn't happened to you, we'll do a here's one I prepared earlier on the wall of red. And then what we'll do is we'll perform a standard migration and look through the generated deployment scripts and just show what's happening in that, what's happening in the deploy all script. And what I'm going to do then is just show you how you can do the workaround, which will be to perform an assessment and edit the model and then do the conversion. So just going back to some of those slides that that Dan was showing before, because these are quite important. So the way our workaround is going to work is that we're going to, a normal, when you do a normal migration using the BizTalk Migrator, you run all of this in one go. You go aim, migrate, and then and it just runs all of these different blocks all together. But there are a couple of different options that we'll take advantage of. One of them is aim assess. So we use the assess option, and the assess will just run this top line here. So it will run discover, parse, analyze, and report, and we can have an option there to output the model. So this target model that we've built in the analyze phase, we can output that. And then the next one we'll look at is using the convert option. So we can do an aim convert, and we provide it with a model, and it just performs the bit where we generate the scripts and the templates, and that allows us to intervene at that point in the process. And just recapping on Dan's diagram here with the message bus, that the config store, the app config, is one artifact we're going to look at, and the one resource we're going to look at, and the artifact store or the integration account is the other one. So I have got a resource group here. So we'll see this one, and I've got and I created this an integration account and an app configuration resource, and then I did a standard deployment, and then ran that, and what I got was something that looks remarkably like this. And this is quite what Valerie calls quite aptly the sea of red. So that's where we start, and then we get errors, and then just everything fails, because once you haven't been able to deploy the expected named integration account, and once you haven't been able to deploy the expected app config, this is what you get. You just get an absolute wall of errors, and that is quite off-putting. So what we're going to go through is just how you can actually then get around some of those problems. So let's just look first. I've got a few command lines here that I'm going to run that just do are going to migrate one of the standard XML mapping scenarios. So I'll run that, and then that will just go through the migrator. So this is using the aim migrate. So this is doing the end-to-end process. And that's this is going through the generation now. And then in my output folder, what we've got is the unpack folder where it's unpacked the contents of the MSI. And then in this aim folder here, this is the result of what's been generated. And as you know from previous ones, that's where our report is. The after stage runner and the before stage runner is the save state. So that's how we can look at the information that's been built up if we want to troubleshoot anything. And you have this conversion folder, which is the actual deployment scripts. So if we go into that one, we have a deploy all and a tear down all, like Dan was saying, and we have a folder for message bus and a folder for applications. And so inside the message bus, if we want to, for example, look at the artifact store, then this is what's been generated. So we have an ARM template here, which is a deployment template for the integration account, and this is parameterized. And so what goes with this is a parameters JSON file. And that one there gives us the name of the artifact store, the location, what the SKU is, and then the tags that go on that. So and so when we deploy it, so when we run the scripts, it will attempt to deploy this into the message bus application. And what I'll also do is show you now the deploy all script, and just have a little look through that. So in the deploy all script, there is an array of file paths, and then this script literally just it loops through those file paths, it filters them and loops through them, and then this is where Dan was saying about the error action. So that's in there. So at the moment it will just continue and it'll try to keep going as best it can, despite the wall of red. And then this file paths, it's just a list of everything that has been generated. So there's a whole ton of scripts in here, and then we filter from that to say which, so the ones that have got the deploy with the numbers, they all get filtered and then executed. And that's how we and that's how the deploy all works. So really, if you want to and this is just designed for when you get this on your workstation and you just want to give it a try. But what you do in terms of putting the output of the BizTalk Migrator into a software development process, you just take the individual scripts and put those as separate artifacts and run those in a DevOps process, like Dan said. So that was really where I got to when I got the wall of red. But what I'm going to do this time, if I just go back to my output folder and delete those and start again, and I'm now going to perform an assessment with the option to output the model. So what we'll do is we'll run this. This will be slightly quicker running because we're not doing all the resource generation. And if I now look in my output, we've got the unpack folder again, but I've got this file here, which is the model.json file. So what we can do now is we can look at this. So we can, for example, so if I look for so we can find we can look in this for find. So let's look for app config, and so we can find the different bits that relate to app config in this file as well. So if we need to tweak any of these things, because we've already got those items, we can do that. But what I'm actually going to do is to show you that when we generate a resource group, for example, it's always the resource group will be consistently named. So we can go into this model, and we can look for all the resource groups in there, and we can rename them. So I can then actually flip across, and I can take the resource group name that I've got for my existing resource, and replace that in there. And that'll take a second because it's quite a big file. There we go. 64 occurrences have been replaced on the message bus resource group. I can then, the integration account that's been generated, I can do the same thing on that. So I keep on clicking on the wrong one. Right, so I keep on doing that. So there we go. So the default integration account I'll replace with my existing one, and replace all on that. I think there should only be one on. Bear with me just 1 second. So I'm also going to replace the replace all the. I've done it again. So I keep on replacing it in this one and not in the and not in here.
Undo is your friend, Andrew. You might want to go back to that your text file where you keep all the samples and undo it, because I think you've lost the original name of the integration account.
I have.
If you do you should be able to undo just in that file, can't you? Oh no, it's going to undo everything. That's all right. Or you could just search through and find the integration account, because it's called an artifact store in the model. So you could search for artifact store and find it.
Yeah. So let's. So I'm very. Is it artifact with an E?
No, it's I. There we go. That's what it's called.
That's what it's called. So I want to replace that with my demo artifact store.
You can tell we're doing this live.
Yeah, we haven't recorded this one. I just and then the and can you just make sure that I don't do something stupid and point me at the app, the generated app config?
Yes. So the app config one.
There, so
that's going to be the new name, isn't it? So
that's the new name.
It's right there. No, the old one's right there. It's still in your file. If you go back to that file, generated app config, app config store. Oh no, you've just done it. You want to go back one? So undo.
No, I think I've done it.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
I think you've done it. Oh, okay, cool. I'll be quiet.
I think I've done it. I think I did it in both. But as it's the last one, we'll do. So, okay. So what I can do now, having changed my my model, I can then run the convert stage. So let's just go back to the command line and run just the convert. So this is aim convert and I pull in the model and run that, and that will do all the resource generation. So we've got a new folder here for the resource generation, and now we've got the conversion. And so if we look in our message bus and we look at the artifact store and we look at things like the deployment on the artifact store, then what we can see in this is that the resource group has been updated to be my existing resource group. And then if we look in the dev parameters, we can then see that it's my Andrew demo existing existing. So that what happens now is when we try to deploy that, it will say it's already there. We can carry on, and we can progress with putting the other artifacts in there. Now, just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to just quickly go to this deploy all and just do some editing on this, because we don't really want to spend all day waiting for API management to deploy. So I'm just going to, so let's see, keep the message bus group and all this messaging manager. I'm just going to take those out. So, and the routing manager and the workflows, I'll take those out as well. And we'll just look at deploying the routing store, the artifact store, and that will include the and that should give us, you know, key vault and that sort of thing. And then I'll take out all these other applications, just so I can just show you that this does actually deploy things into the right thing. So there we go. I've changed my deploy all script. That is in this folder. So if I go back to my command prompt now, go there and I go PowerShell. So what we'll do now is we'll do the deployment, and we should start to find that things will go through now without the sea of red. And this is, and so I'll just talk while this script is running. So this is a little bit fiddly because we're intervening in the in the deployment, but it is actually a reasonably reliable way of reusing an app config and an integration account. But the downside is that we are putting all these other artifacts in the same resource group as well. So there we go. What we see now is that key vault is deploying. So it's deploying the key vault, so that's good. We're getting somewhere now. Things are happening. So let's just let that go through for a minute, and then we'll look in the Azure portal to see when that appears. So here's my existing artifacts resource group. So I'll just keep refreshing that, and there's our key vault. So the deployment now has been repointed to use our existing integration account. It's been repointed to use our existing app configuration, and we'll start getting other resources coming into this existing resource group. That then becomes your new message bus app, and then we can use that for the rest of our applications. So that really is what I was going to demonstrate today. So we've successfully repointed that. It was slightly went off the rails by the fact that I can't use search and replace, but it also. But it copy and paste, but it also proves that we are doing this live. So yeah, I hope that helped you understand really how the model that's being built and the deployment sort of fit together. And you know, and we look forward to more features coming out in the BizTalk Migrator that make this stuff easier and become functions of the tool rather than us having to work around it. So I'll stop sharing there. And Dan, have you got?
Yeah, I'll switch back to the last slide now. Okay. So one of the things just to say about that is I can imagine a number of people watching that going, it's how hard to do that? And you're right. Yes, it's not ideal at the moment. It's not ideal, the fact that if you want to reuse your own integration account or app config, everything's got to be in the same resource group. So one of the things is working with Microsoft and the community to say, well, let's update a couple of things. Let's update the deploy all script so that it uses that prereq. So it goes through, you know, that nice thing of allowing you to select your subscription and making sure that when you do your deployment, you know where you're going. And then let's also update the ARM template to allow for separate resource groups. Yeah. So if we did that, so that there was a specific separate resource group for the integration account and app configuration and API management, you could say, well, actually, I don't want them all in the same resource group. Even though there's a message bus resource group, I've got an existing API management I want to use, or an existing integration account, and they're in a different resource group. So the first step towards that is to say, well, let's modify the ARM templates so that they take that in as a parameter instead of taking in the message bus one. And that would make it a lot easier for us to write a little batch file that could change it all for you. The longer term thing would be to say, well, what if I run the tool and I want to supply the name of the existing app config and the resource group it's in, and the name of an existing API management resource and the resource group it's in, or whatever. You could supply a list of those as you run the tool. That would be the ideal place to get to. So you say, this is what I want to do. And when it generates the scripts at the end, it's going to use your existing ones. That would be the logical endpoint for this. But there's work involved in doing that. The existing API management resource, we didn't show that today. It's a little bit more complex, simply because what the scripts do is they deploy API management, and that's what takes 45 minutes if it doesn't exist already. And then it has to set up a whole lot of named values and permissions, and then it takes the subscription ID for one of the products and puts it into Key Vault, so then the logic apps can get it from there when they do their deployment. So there's a bit more involved in that, and it would be a matter of working out, would you be okay if you've got an existing API management with those changes being made to your API management, creating a managed service identity, for example? That gets done as well. So you'd have to be aware of what the scripts are going to do to your existing API management, because you don't want to find that what it does is it breaks something in your existing API management. Yeah. And then also updating the existing documentation as well. So all this will need to be done. But this is improvements to the tool. This is the type of thing that will make it, really helpful and really useful. All right, that's all I have, Valerie.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. That is going to be very helpful, and I think we do need to get that batch file and script put into the repo, so into GitHub, so that it'll be available to people. So we should be able to do that within the next couple of days here, so people can start using that script, because I know it'll be very helpful. It would have been very helpful with a couple of customers I've worked with, and so that'll be a good tool to have. So do let us know if there are other subjects that you'd like to have us cover on these monthly webcasts. We do have an alias, BizTalk Migration at Microsoft.com, that you can send email to. And that goes to a few of us at Microsoft, and we'll get back to you. Or if you have suggestions, we can take those suggestions. So thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate having you be here.
So Valerie, we've just had a question from David on the chat. We could just cover that off quickly before we end.
Absolutely, yes.
So, and it's really talking about the schemas and schema references. So this is a really useful thing for people to know about. So I thought we'd just talk about this. So when the reason why we go on about integration accounts and deploying the integration account so much is that's amongst other things, that's where we put the schemas and the maps. And the question here is about the hierarchy of schemas, because when you create schemas on file and you're referencing another schema, you can put a path to that schema, and it's really just confirming how those work in the when we actually deploy them in an integration account, because the schemas in an integration account, they so I was hoping you'd have an example ready, Dan, that we could just show this on.
Well, the question I think that David's asking, if I get it right, is about hierarchies. Now, yes, they're flat, David. And this is really a question for probably for John or someone about integration accounts. When you upload schemas, they're all flat. They're just uploaded into here. If you can say this is the integration account here, okay? And behind each one, there's a JSON file that describes where the actual schema is and some properties on that schema. Now, as far as I'm aware, I think you can have reference schemas, but I don't think you can have folders. Yeah. So there's no folder option. So you can't have a parent schema and then a folder with a whole of child schemas in it. I think they're all just put in one place. It's just like having them all in one folder. But the references is a really good question. And I believe that you can reference other schemas in here because I think that's how EDI does it. Although I haven't played around with it too much. I don't know if you know more, Valerie.
No, I don't know more. And I know that there will be some Logic Apps Live sessions that'll be coming up. So David, be on the lookout. We tweet those when those are coming out. So this may be a good question on a Logic Apps Live session as well. And then, David, if you want to email to biztalkmigration@microsoft.com or valerie.rob@microsoft.com, I'll have your information. I can get back to you on that as well.
I think just to say, David, that if your existing schemas refer to other schemas, like you've got a schema location or reference to another schema that's in a subfolder, you'll have to modify that schema. If it refers to it by name at the same level, if it's flat, it should work in the integration account, as far as I'm aware. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty certain that would work.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. And